The room would explode tomorrow, but the warning shot was fired today, quietly, with a single sentence that nobody in attendance realized would change everything. Because what looked like an ordinary boxing press conference was actually the moment Evander Holyfield decided to test whether Mike Tyson was still the most dangerous man in the sport or just a legend living on borrowed fear. And by the time the cameras stopped rolling, everyone in that room understood they'd just witnessed the beginning of something far bigger than trash talk. The ballroom was neutral territory, beige walls, harsh overhead lights, rows of journalists packed shoulder to shoulder, microphones clustered like landmines on a long table at the front, and sitting there under the lights were two men whose history was already soaked in blood, controversy, and unfinished business. Mike Tyson and Evander Holyfield, separated by a few chairs and an ocean of tension that no promoter could smooth over. Mike arrived first, sunglasses on indoors, jaw set tight, body rocking subtly, as if his muscles were coiled springs that never fully relaxed anymore. His presence alone changing the temperature of the room the way it always had, because even years removed from his absolute prime, people didn't see Mike Tyson as a retired champion. They saw him as a force that could still snap without warning. Holyfield arrived moments later, calm, composed, dressed neatly, nodding politely as he took his seat, looking less like a man preparing for violence, and more like someone who'd already made peace with whatever was coming next. And that contrast alone made reporters lean forward in their chairs, because they'd seen this dynamic before, the storm and the anchor, the explosion waiting for something solid to push against. The moderator started with safe questions, career reflections, legacy talk, respectful nods to the past, the kind of setup designed to let everyone leave with clean headlines and no surprises. And for a few minutes, it worked. Mike answered briefly, guarded, almost bored, while Holyfield spoke with the measured confidence of someone who never needed to raise his voice to be heard. But then a reporter asked about dominance, about whether fear still mattered in modern boxing, and Holyfield leaned forward slightly, hands folded, eyes drifting not to the reporter but to Mike, and when he spoke, the tone shifted so subtly that half the room missed it at first. Fear doesn't make you a champion, Holyfield said evenly, discipline does, and Mike's rocking stopped, just for a moment, his head tilting almost imperceptibly, because those weren't just words, they were a challenge dressed up as philosophy. Holyfield continued, his voice steady, unhurried. A real champion doesn't need chaos around him. And that's when the silence spread, the kind that crawls across a room when people sense something unscripted is happening. Mike turned his head slowly toward Holyfield, sunglasses hiding his eyes, but not the tension in his jaw. Not the way his shoulders squared as if preparing for impact. Holyfield didn't look away. He didn't smirk. He didn't escalate. He just held Mike there, in the open, in front of cameras, in front of the world. And then he said it. The sentence that would be replayed endlessly by tomorrow morning. If you still think you're the champ, Holyfield said, calm as a confession, prove it. The words landed heavy, not loud, not dramatic, but precise, and the room reacted instantly. Reporters freezing mid-keystroke, a cameraman inhaling sharply, a promoter shifting in his chair as if physically uncomfortable, because that wasn't hype, that wasn't promotion, that was an attack on identity, and in boxing, identity is everything. Mike didn't respond right away, and that silence stretched longer than any answer could have, because everyone knew what those words meant to him, knew what he'd built his entire life around, knew how deeply he associated dominance with respect and respect with survival. When Mike finally spoke, his voice was low, controlled, almost eerily calm. You don't get to decide who I am, he said, and Holyfield nodded, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement, like a man who'd just confirmed a hypothesis. The moderator tried to steer things back, cracked a nervous joke, asked about training camps, but the damage was done, the line had been crossed, and nothing that followed could uncross it. Mike answered the remaining questions tersely, clipped sentences, his body language closed off now, while Holyfield remained composed, occasionally glancing toward Mike, but never pressing again, because he didn't need to. The seed was planted. As the conference wrapped up, chairs scraped against the floor, reporters rushed for exits to file their stories, and security subtly tightened their positions, because everyone could feel it, that hum beneath the surface, that sense that something had been awakened. Mike stood up abruptly, not looking at Holyfield, not acknowledging anyone, and walked out with his team close behind him, sunglasses still on, fists clenched just enough to notice. Holyfield watched him go, expression unreadable, then rose calmly, answered a few final questions with polite vagueness, and left through the opposite door. By the time the ballroom emptied, the story had already escaped the room, spreading through phones and whispers and hurried headlines. But what nobody could see yet was what was happening behind closed doors, inside Mike Tyson's head, with that single sentence replayed on a loop, louder each time, because Holyfield hadn't questioned his record, hadn't insulted his past, he'd challenged his present, and Mike Tyson had never been very good at letting that kind of thing go. Tomorrow, the room would erupt. Tomorrow, chaos would take over. But this was the moment it started, quiet, controlled, and far more dangerous because of it. By that night, the words had stopped being Holyfield's and started becoming something else entirely, something heavier, because once a challenge like that is spoken out loud, especially to a man like Mike Tyson, it doesn't fade, it settles, it echoes, it crawls into every quiet moment and refuses to leave. Mike's hotel room was dark except for the faint glow of the city bleeding through the curtains, the sounds of traffic far below muted and distant, and inside that room, there was no television on, no music playing, no conversation, just pacing, slow and relentless, back and forth across the carpet like a caged animal measuring the limits of its enclosure. His team tried to talk to him at first, voices low, careful, telling him it was just psychological warfare, just another angle, just Holyfield being Holyfield. But Mike didn't answer, didn't acknowledge them, because to him it wasn't strategy, it was disrespect wrapped in calm language, and that was worse than an insult. He replayed the moment again and again, not just the sentence, but the way Holyfield said it, the lack of fear, the stillness, the certainty, and every time he thought about it, his jaw tightened a little more, his breathing got a little heavier, because fear had always been the currency Mike understood best. Fear was how he'd survived the streets, how he'd ruled the ring, how he'd built an aura that ended fights before the first bell rang. And now another man had stood in front of cameras and questioned whether that aura was real anymore. Sleep never came. Not really. Just short stretches of restless half-dreams broken by flashes of memory, old fights, old knockouts, old nights when the world bent around him. And when morning arrived, it found Mike already awake, already dressed, already vibrating with a kind of energy that made the people around him uneasy. Word had spread overnight. Headlines multiplying, clips looping on sports channels, radio hosts arguing about whether Holyfield had crossed a line or played a masterstroke. And by the time Mike arrived at the venue for the next day's media appearance, the atmosphere had shifted completely. Security was thicker, guards positioned closer to the stage, handlers hovering just a step nearer than usual, because everyone involved could feel it, that today wasn't about promotion anymore, it was about containment. The room filled faster than the day before, more cameras, more reporters, more bodies pressed together, all of them there not for answers, but for a moment. And when Mike walked in, the noise dipped instantly, conversations trailing off as heads turned, because whatever composure he'd shown the day before was gone now, replaced by something sharper, something rawer, his sunglasses back on, his face hard, his movements abrupt. Holyfield was already seated again, calm as ever, posture relaxed, hands resting loosely in front of him, looking less like a man bracing for confrontation and more like someone watching a storm approach from solid ground. The moderator opened with rehearsed pleasantries, voice too bright, questions too safe, but the tension in the room made every word feel fragile, like glass about to crack, and Mike answered minimally, his responses clipped, his impatience visible even through the dark lenses. Then came the question that tipped everything forward, simple on the surface, asked by a reporter trying to sound neutral. Evander, do you think Mike has changed since his championship years? And Holyfield didn't hesitate, didn't glance at the moderator, didn't soften his tone. He just looked straight at Mike and said, I think pressure reveals who you really are. The effect was immediate, like oxygen hitting flame, because Mike's head snapped up, his chair scraping slightly as he leaned forward, and for a split second, the entire room held its breath. You saying I can't handle pressure? Mike shot back, his voice already rising. already losing that careful control from the day before. Holyfield didn't raise his voice to match him. He didn't lean in. He didn't move at all. "I'm saying a champion stays composed," he replied. And that was the moment, the exact instant when the last thread of restraint snapped. Mike stood up so fast his chair toppled backward with a loud crack against the floor. Microphones squealed as bodies surged forward, reporters scrambling out of the way as security reacted a beat too late. "You don't know nothing about me," Mike yelled, ripping off his sunglasses, eyes blazing now, exposed. "You don't get to test me." Hands grabbed at his arms, his shoulders, his waist, trying to hold him back as he lunged forward, the chaos spreading through the room like a shockwave, cameras shaking, voices overlapping, someone shouting for calm, someone else shouting for security. In the middle of it all, Holyfield stayed seated, watching, his expression unreadable, his body still, and when Mike screamed again, straining against the people restraining him, Holyfield finally spoke, quietly, almost sadly. "This is what I meant." That line cut deeper than any insult could have, because it reframed everything happening in real time, turning Mike's fury into evidence, and the room felt it. The shift, the way perception tilted in that single second. Security finally dragged Mike back, away from the table, his shouts echoing as he was pulled toward the exit, his team trying to calm him, failing, while reporters shouted questions no one answered, and cameras caught every second, every vein in his neck, every flash of rage. When the doors finally slammed shut behind him, the room was wrecked, chairs overturned, microphones broken, the air buzzing with adrenaline and disbelief, and only then did Holyfield stand, straightening his jacket calmly, as if nothing unusual had happened. He stepped up to the microphones, glanced briefly at the chaos left behind, and spoke evenly. "That's the difference between being dangerous and being disciplined," then turned and walked out, leaving the room to erupt behind him. By the end of the day, the footage was everywhere, slowed down, analyzed, argued over, but the damage was already done, because the question Holyfield had asked wasn't whether Mike could still fight. It was whether he could still control himself. And in front of the world, under the brightest lights, Mike Tyson had answered it without meaning to. By the time the footage finished looping on sports networks that night, the fight itself had almost become secondary, because what people were really reacting to wasn't the outburst, it was what it revealed. And in boxing, revelation can be more damaging than defeat. Analysts replayed the moment frame by frame, pausing on Mike Tyson's eyes when the sunglasses came off, on the way his body surged forward before his mind caught up, while commentators spoke in careful tones about passion and intensity. But beneath the surface, a different conversation was taking shape, one about control, about whether the most feared fighter of his generation was still in command of the very thing that once made him unstoppable. Holyfield didn't need to say anything more, and that silence became part of the story too, because while Mike disappeared behind closed doors with his team, Holyfield went home, attended his scheduled obligations, and answered questions with the same measured calm, repeating variations of the same idea, that greatness wasn't about intimidation, it was about mastery of self. Inside Mike's camp, the mood was darker, quieter, the adrenaline burned off and replaced by something heavier, a realization that the narrative had slipped out of their hands, because no matter how they framed it, no matter how many times they said he was just fired up, the image was set, a man being physically restrained, shouting as another man sat calmly and watched. Mike spent that night alone, trainers and handlers giving him space, and in that quiet, the echoes came back stronger than ever. The sentence Holyfield had spoken the day before, the one that started it all, now layered with the memory of the room erupting around him, and for the first time in a long time, Mike was forced to confront something he'd always outrun, the possibility that fear no longer bent the world the way it used to. When fight night finally arrived weeks later, the atmosphere was electric, sold-out arena, cameras flashing, commentators hyping redemption and revenge. But something had shifted subtly, because when Mike walked to the ring, the crowd's roar was loud, but it wasn't unified. It carried an edge of uncertainty, and when Holyfield followed, calm and focused, the contrast was impossible to ignore. Inside the ring, the truth revealed itself slowly, not in a single dramatic moment, but round by round. As Holyfield absorbed the early aggression, stayed disciplined, stuck to his plan, while Mike burned energy, chased moments, looked for the kind of sudden domination that used to come naturally, but now had to be forced. Each clinch, each exchange, each reset reinforced the same lesson that had been previewed at the press conference. That power without control fades. That fear without discipline expires. When the fight ended, when the decision was announced, the outcome felt less like a shock and more like a confirmation of something that had already been decided long before the first bell, back in that quiet ballroom under harsh lights. In the aftermath, as headlines moved on and new stories took their place, the press conference moment remained, replayed in documentaries, discussed in gyms, cited by fighters and trainers as a turning point, not just in a rivalry, but in how people understood dominance in the sport. Mike Tyson would continue to fight, continue to draw attention, continue to be one of the most fascinating figures boxing had ever produced. But something fundamental had shifted that day, because Holyfield had exposed a truth without ever throwing a punch, that the most dangerous battles aren't always fought with fists, and that sometimes the quickest way to unseat a king is to challenge the thing he relies on most. Years later, when people looked back on that rivalry, they wouldn't just talk about the punches or the outcomes. They'd talk about the moment before it all unraveled, the moment a calm voice asked a simple question in front of the world, and a legend answered with chaos. That was the real fight, the one that mattered most, the one that decided everything before anyone stepped into the ring. And it ended the instant Mike Tyson lost control and Evander Holyfield never did.